Welcome to the Bearded Bereans, where we analyze topics of the day in the light of the scriptures.
Well, welcome to Season 2, Episode 3. Is it Episode 3 already?
It's Episode 3.
We are moving fast. Or is it, we're moving fastly? I don't know which.
Quickly.
Quickly. Yeah, we're moving quickly. It's kind of exciting to be moving through this material at the rate that we're doing it. And I'm really excited to talk about Crane Brinton and is it Brinton? Brinton?
Yes. Crane Brinton.
I'm excited to hear a little bit more about what Neil Gordon has to say concerning revolutions, and that's our topic for today. But before we move into that, please tell me you're smoking something other than a Valkyrie tonight.
Well, yeah, I actually have sort of a nice little treat here. This is a gift from a local listener.
Oh.
Yeah, it is from the Big Sky Cigar Company, which is a local little boutique cigar company here in Billings, Montana. So shout out to them. I've never actually had one of these before. I've never had any of their stuff before, but I see them around, and I don't know. Anyway, someone gave it as a gift, listener to the show. So I'm going to try it out here and give a little review. So shout out to Big Sky Cigar Company. I think they've got several different cigars, and I think they're all named after mountain ranges here in Montana.
Cool.
But this one looks like it's a Habano wrapper. And I don't know what's on the inside of it, but we'll find out pretty soon.
Yeah, I'm a little jealous, to be honest. Local listeners in the Alabama area, I'm waiting.
Yeah, what's going on, man?
What's the deal? I think they like the professor more, but that's a good thing, man. That's exciting. So yeah, I want to hear your review. I'm a fan of Habano wrappers. It's actually one of my favorite cigars. So
yeah, they call this the Bitterroot.
The Bitterroot. Is there a mountain range called the Bitterroot?
Yes, there is. It's on the western side over by Missoula, Bitterroot Mountain Range. So
awesome. Well, I guess it's time. I am smoking again the Immaculata.
Yes.
And
of course you are.
Yeah, you know what's funny is I still have a ton of these. Thank you, co-host. And they are delicious. So,
well, there was that one day here, like I don't know, 2 months ago now, when you had a pipe and you played it off like, yeah, well, we're talking about C.S. Lewis, so I decided to smoke a pipe today. He ran out of cigars. So I'm gonna have to send him some.
I'm glad you were picking up what I was laying down, smelling what I was stepping in, so on and so forth, etc. So we have covered, I think, in good detail, the current state of affairs in America that we certainly have two, maybe oil and water in the same jar. We certainly have two ideologies that do not mix well in the same country, and it's never been more polemicized or certainly never been as, I don't know, the temperature has never been as high in my lifetime. And so we're really talking about how do we move forward, how as a Christian to move forward faithfully. And we have introduced this wonderful essay by Neil Gordon, and we've gotten to the part where he uses a book by Crane Brinton. Where does he start? I know that he uses four revolutions and looks at them, the broad strokes, how those revolutions came about, the things that precipitated each revolution, and how each revolution proceeded, and really gives us a 30,000 foot view of how revolutions come about and how they are executed. And I think he even goes a little bit into post-revolutionary issues. And so, uh, tell us a little bit about how he's structured this chapter.
Yeah, so you should definitely read Brinton's book. It's worth reading. So don't just take our word for it here. Definitely pick that up and read it for yourself. But what Brinton does is he analyzes four successful revolutions: the English Revolution of the 1640s, the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and then the Russian Revolution. And he admits his science is not exact, but he paints with these really sort of broad strokes the general picture of the course that each of these four revolutions follows. And so what Neil Gordon does in part two of his essay is he breaks down the whole book and identifies, I think, six stages of a revolution. And Brinton doesn't go through and number them like in stage one, this happens, in stage two, that happens. But Gordon does. He goes through and he identifies six different steps or stages that each of these revolutions go through. And so he breaks it down into like 2 or 3 pages. Brinton takes, I don't know, 300 pages to do it. So Gordon's analysis is a little bit easier to get through.
Yeah, we'll call it more succinct.
Yeah, it's
Is
a
that
little bit
fair?
more succinct. Well, Brinton goes through all this detail about how he arrived at these conclusions and the things about each of the revolutions that that fed into these conclusions, and he identifies the parts on all of them. And Neil Gordon just goes, "This is stage one. This is stage two. Here's stage three." So he
Yeah.
just sort of takes it all and distills it down into what are the actual stages. And before I jump into what Gordon has to say, both Gordon and Brinton, I think, recognize that it's not an exact science,
Yeah.
and it's way easier looking back in time to point at an event or a series of events, and say, okay, that's where the revolution shifted from this phase to the next phase.
Hmm.
And it's way more difficult in the midst of a revolution to say, oh, this thing that's happening right now, this is the transition from this to that.
Yeah.
And because it's not an exact science, it's not as though they always go in nice, neat order. There's overlap between the stages. Some stages last a really long time, and there's a lot of overlap with the next stage. Some of them, they're really short, and there's no overlap with the next stage. It all just depends on the context. So keep those things in mind as we go through this. Because in the second part of this part, or second half of this part of Gordon's essay, he's going to take this information and tell us where he thinks we are in our own society currently in what he calls the modern American Revolution. So I'm going to jump into this, and maybe if you want, ask some questions as we go along, ask some clarifying questions.
Mm-hmm.
That might be kind of nice, and then we'll see how it goes. So, according to Gordon, Brinton starts off by identifying what he calls these preliminary signs. They're things that indicate that a revolution may be coming. He notes that there's structural weaknesses within society. There's economic weaknesses, political weaknesses, social weaknesses. They're not like drastic life or death sort of things, but they're more like cracks in the foundation.
Hmm.
The economy hasn't collapsed, but it's certainly weaker than it could be. So there's things that sort of it's not really writing on the wall, but there's signs that something might be coming. And he said those are present in all of the four revolutions that he looked at. And
Mm-hmm.
then Brinton also points out that at some point before the revolution starts to take place, there's this shift of allegiance amongst the intellectual thinkers of the society. And he points out that within every society, the intellectuals are always criticizing those who are in power, those who are in government, but it starts off with a criticism in order to make better.
Hmm.
right? It's hey, have you thought about doing this? Let's look at doing things this way. So they're always critiquing, but it's a critique in order to enhance. And he says at some point before the revolution takes off, there's an allegiance shift where the intellectuals no longer critique in order to make the current regime better, but they start to critique in order to bring down the current regime. And they start to talk in ways as if the current regime has become unredeemable in some way. And they're no longer seeking to make it better. They're now talking like they would like to sweep it away and maybe go in a different direction. Any initial thoughts on those two things?
Well, yeah, it is interesting looking at the four revolutions that he looks at and putting these things together. It has to be, like you say, it's an inexact science. You do have to go more generic on your understanding of what's happening because all these revolutions clearly were different cultures, different reasons for them. And that's one of the things that is interesting to me as an American, obviously. I usually call the American Revolution the war for independence. And so it's there's certainly major differences between these revolutions. And what he's done is he's taken and not looked at the individual little things that have the machinations of different things that have gone on. He's really saying, regardless of how these things started, um, all these elements are present in each one, and I think that's helpful because it really allows you to apply it to other cultures, right? It's not just these four. I'm sure if these are present in these four, it probably stands to reason that we could look at other revolutions, even, you know, uh, cultural revolutions that maybe aren't as well known and see some of the same things. So I do appreciate, well, hey, yeah, the economy could be better. You know, does that necessarily mean that that's a crack in the foundation? No, but it could be, right? The the intellectual elite are no longer interested in improving. That's probably a little bit more of a crack in the foundation, right? Once the intellectual elite changes their goal in what they say and how they think and what they do, um, I think that that's really helpful in conceptualizing what is happening pre-revolution, or at least at the beginning stages of revolution.
Yeah, and these circumstances exist in lots of different societies. They don't necessarily lead to uh, a revolution,
Right.
but they are things that that do come before them. So
Hmm.
uh, they're indicators that it's a possibility. They're not evidence that it's an absolute that it's going to happen. And I'll point out too that there's a lot of other things that were present in each of the four circumstances that Brinton looks at that the other three didn't necessarily have. So they all had
Hmm.
unique features to them as well. And so
Yes.
what Gordon is looking at here is the overlap between all four of them.
But that's
Uh,
that's what makes it eminently applicable.
yeah.
Is it allows for you to take these things and apply to it, like I said, another culture where it's like, you know what, there's a lot more going on here than these, but this is clearly happening.
All right. So that's not even stage one. That's just some precursors that exist before stage one. According to
Right.
Gordon, the first stage is an increase in protests and propaganda against the old regime. And I should stop right here and define the terms real quick. So he uses the term old regime to refer to that, um, the government or the regime that's operating the government at the point in time when the revolution starts.
Right.
Okay. And then he's going to use the term new regime, which is the one that takes over after the old regime. And then there's going to be a third regime and a fourth regime. But just so you know what he means by old regime, it's the one that's been in power, leading up to and before the revolution.
Yeah, the initial regime to be usurped or
Yeah.
subverted in some way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Yep. So there's this increase in protests and propaganda against the old regime. These protests, they might be peaceful, they might be violent, they might be a mixture of the two. But he says that in the end, they always end up at least flirting with violence in some way, if not using it as an overt tool to achieve their ends.
Now that's an interesting distinction. So I'm assuming there's a uh, there is a revolution that he looked at that really didn't have the same type of violence in that stage. Why make that distinction there? Why say violence or at least flirting with violence? And what does flirting with violence mean?
Well, look at the American Revolution. Um, there were some violent acts that took place, but it really wasn't the colonists who were committing the violent acts. I mean, you think of the Boston Massacre, right? You had a
Right,
bunch of people throwing snowballs at British soldiers trying to get them to respond.
and they did.
That's and they did, right? That's almost
Yeah,
like flirting with violence. But you think of the Boston Tea Party, and they went in and they threw all the tea into the harbor, but they swept and cleaned the ship, and somebody even broke a lock. That was the one piece of property other than the tea that was damaged,
yeah,
and they left money on the
to replace
ship
the lock.
to replace the lock.
Locks are expensive.
So, I mean, once the revolution, became full blown, obviously there was violence involved because it was a war. But
Sure.
in this initial stage, it sort of flirted with violence a little bit, and the colonists really didn't use violence as a tool to achieve their end. They
Yeah,
used protest, but not necessarily violence. Where other ones, certainly used violence. You think of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution, violence was much more their cup of tea than it
yeah,
was for us.
yeah.
So he says that intellectuals whose allegiance, of course, has previously shifted start to fill the media with propaganda, decrying what they see as the tyranny of the old regime. And the protests and the propaganda intensify until the old regime is challenged um, through force and rhetoric. So whether that's through the force of protest, or actually violent force, or through some sort of media and propaganda and the rhetoric, the rhetorical attacks that are coming from the revolutionists, the old regime is challenged through those things, which then necessitates a response
Mhm.
from the old regime. And that's the completion of stage one.
Yeah, I don't have anything to add to that. So take a drag, enjoy your cigar.
Okay. So it's pretty good so far, I have to say. One of the keys to happiness in life is low expectations.
Sure.
And I try to maintain low expectations. And I did coming into this cigar, and my expectations have been exceeded. So,
That that's good. That's good. That's actually high praise coming from Jason Bolt.
mm-hmm. So, so sometimes when people describe a cigar as being earthy,
Mm-hmm.
what they really mean is dirty,
Mm-hmm.
like you're smoking dirt.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so most cigars that are described as earthy, I don't like.
Yeah.
But this, I, I'm tempted to use the word earthy, but it's um, more like things that have grown out of the earth,
Right. Right.
than the earth itself. So like a really nicely tilled organic soil. Um, yeah, it's been pretty good so far. So, anyways,
Hmm.
the old regime is challenged, and which necessitates a response, and that leads to the second stage, which is
Mhm.
the response from the old regime. And it's really key here. Actually, Brinton and Gordon comment on this, that this is actually a fork in the road in a revolution. The old regime has two options. It can respond with sufficient force to destroy the revolution, either through rhetoric or through force. Both of those things are possible. Um, or it can respond with insufficient force to destroy the revolution, either through rhetoric or force. Um, and depending on what the old regime does at this point, according to both Gordon and Brinton, determines the ultimate success of the revolution.
Hmm.
They say that if the old regime responds with sufficient force to squash the revolution, then it becomes what they call an abortive revolution. Um, Britain refers to the American Civil War as an abortive revolution.
Hmm.
The old regime responded with sufficient military force to crush the revolution, and it ended. It took, 4 or 5 years, but they crushed it. Um,
Yeah, reading through the essay, I did have that question. Uh, Looking at the Civil War in the South and their actions, it is interesting that that would be considered an abortive revolution, mainly because it does seem to me that their I don't think their goal was to their goal wasn't regime change in the North, right? I mean, their goal was to be left alone. And of course, the Fort Sumter thing happened, and I get that. I don't know. So help me. Is it just another broad strokes discussion here? Is that why we're saying, okay, well, we could categorize that as an abortive revolution because, a war did happen, people died, there was sufficient response, and that's what an abortive revolution could look like or would look like. I don't know. What are your thoughts there?
I think you can categorize it as a revolution.
Hmm.
They weren't seeking to overthrow the government in Washington, but they were seeking to overthrow the uh, the influence or the control that the government in Washington had over the other
Over
states.
them. Yeah, yeah.
And it's very similar to the American Revolution, right? We didn't seek to overthrow the government in London. Uh,
Fair. Yeah,
we just wanted them to not control us anymore. So in that sense, the two are very similar.
yeah, yeah.
But
One is accepted today and one is not.
um,
Interesting.
whenever
Interesting.
I teach U.S. history, I always pointed out that the argument for the Confederate States philosophically and politically is identical to the argument that the colonists were making
Yeah.
in the 1770s, um, and of course we praise the one and we condemn the other, which I always find interesting, and then my students, of course, find that interesting, and they say, "Well, why is that, Mr. Bolt?" Well, I don't know. You should read a little bit more about it and reach your own conclusions.
So, Jay, I'm going to give you just a second, a moment to consider what you just said and apologize for it, just to keep us from getting canceled. Because let's be honest, that viewpoint could get us canceled, you know. And I want to protect our show. No apology forthcoming.
You know, I don't care. Like, what's the point in being on here if we can't tell the truth, right? Like,
Yeah.
so this is the thing that Seth Dillon said in his talk a couple of weeks ago when he was here in Billings, a fundraiser for our school. And this is one of the most, I think, important things that he said in his talk. Something that I had never actually thought of before. Is he said the vast majority of censorship that takes place is actually self-censorship.
Yep.
It's in putting this fear upon people like you and me that,
I better
well, if
not
we
say
say a
that.
certain thing, we
Yeah.
might get taken off, and we might get
Yeah.
canceled, we might get locked out of our account, so we better not do it. And we end up censoring ourselves, and they don't even have to do it to us. I mean,
Yeah.
how crazy is that? And so, no, I
Yeah.
don't have any apologies.
No, no. If
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 we're
you
going to
did
be censored, they're
apologize,
going to have to do it to us.
no, that absolutely. One of the things Jordan Peterson says is, in order to think, you have to risk being offensive, and
Hmm.
the the reality is, we serve a God of truth, and so we ought to seek truth not only in the ultimate things, but also in the minutia. We ought to look for the truth in history, and one of the ways that the left has silenced conservatives is by deeming certain things, while they may be true, deeming them unspeakable. And I think a lot of people. I mean, I remember in public school being told by a liberal professor that the Civil War was fought over states' rights. Okay, that's not something that is even discussed today. and
Right.
and so they know the truth, but they weaponize the truth in order to shut you up. And it always cracks me up when Tucker's talking about that. He's like, well, shut up, like people are saying shut up to him. But anyway, it is an interesting phenomena that, and it's true, we self censor all the time. And this happens in pulpits across America. This happens on social media all the time. It's not just how many clicks I'm not going to get, or I'm going to get kicked off this platform. The self-censoring thing is happening in weak invertebrate pulpits now, today. It's happening all over America. And that's one of the things that I would like to see restored, if a reformation was to come across, is bringing back the backbone to American pulpits. And that's a little bit of a sidetrack. I remember asking a friend of mine who was struggling with something that was going on in her church, and struggling with some things with her husband. And one of the things I asked her is like, well, are you going to an effeminate church? Right? Or does the church tell you the truth? And she couldn't grasp the thought there. And maybe now she is grasping that. But the reality is, when I call a church effeminate, all I'm saying is they're weak-willed men that are running that church, and they're not telling the truth, no matter what. They are formulating what they say in order to not be censored, or to not be banned, or to not lose their tithers, or you name it, right? And so, yes, huge rabbit trail, but I think that's a really important thing to discuss when we're talking about revolutions, because you talk about the American Revolution, it's a well-known fact that that would not have happened, would it not have been for a strong pulpit in Presbyterian churches across America.
Yep.
The Black Robe Regiment.
Yep.
That would not have happened unless those men got up in the pulpit and spoke the truth about where rights come from, and about how we as men ought to respond to tyranny. So, rant over. Crane Brinton.
Okay, rant over Crane Brinton. There's this fork in the road, and the old regime responds either with sufficient force to squash the revolution, the rebellion, or with insufficient force. And obviously, if the old regime responds with sufficient force, it's over, and we just kind of move on. But if the regime responds with insufficient force, it might take a long, long time still, but both Brinton and Gordon say that the revolution ultimately succeeds because
Mm-hmm.
the old regime has demonstrated that it is either unwilling or unable to do what is necessary to stop the revolution. And that has the effect of emboldening the revolution and showing
Mm-hmm.
them, look, we can actually succeed. Let's keep going.
Yep.
And that is indeed what ends up happening. They become emboldened and they keep going and they move through the rest of the stages and ultimately succeed. And I will make one last point on the second stage here, and this comes straight from Gordon. Is he sort of pauses and he says, take note of this fork in the road, because if we are in the middle of a revolution now, which he argues that we are, if we are past this fork in the road, then our situation is dire.
Yeah.
So
Our
keep that in
options
mind. Our
become
options
very
are
limited.
extremely limited. There are
Yeah.
still options, but they become extremely limited, and the window is shrunken significantly.
Mm.
So I'll make that point since he did.
Yeah, and I think because that is an important point, I'm kind of curious. How do you think the French ought to have responded whenever these rumblings were beginning. I mean, they clearly came to this fork in the road, and they didn't come down on the revolutionaries like a ton of bricks. Same with Britain and America. I mean, it took them a while to engage. I mean, uh, they didn't send a significant enough amount of force over to take care of the problem. They they kind of slow pedaled it, right, and then ratcheted things up when they realized, oh no, these guys are actually
Right,
effective in their tactics that we've never
right,
seen before.
right.
You know.
But at that point, it's too late. Like
Mm-hmm.
we've gone past the fork in the road, and because you've emboldened them and you've given them a little bit of a taste, they're not going to give up now.
Right.
And so even if they then respond later, it's too late. Uh,
Yeah.
according to Britain, at least, it's too
Well,
late. So
I can conceptualize maybe it okay. Yes, it's probably too late because the significant amount of brutality that it would take to eradicate that emboldened hope. I don't think even the most evil men would be able to inflict that amount of brutality. I really don't. So I think he's got a point.
well, if they weren't willing to do it at the fork in the road, they're not going to be willing to do it down the road. They may be willing to invest a lot of blood and treasure,
Hmm.
but if they weren't willing to do it at the first, they're not going to be willing to do what it takes in the latter stages either.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point.
So
So.
this leads to the third stage. Let's see here. Gordon says, following the inevitable success of the revolution, um, if the old regime responds with insufficient force to squash it, um, the old regime is displaced and the moderate wing of the revolution becomes the new regime. So we're at a point now where the old regime has been toppled and a new ruling entity comes into place. And he says that the moderates are almost naturally sort of step into power. They're the ones who are willing to negotiate. They're the ones who are able to politic. They were maybe the opposition party or something like that, leading up to the revolution. They're the ones who are preconditioned to find common ground and look for solutions that work. Um, it says there's vestiges of the old regime that are still embedded in society, and the moderates are willing to utilize the things that are left over from the old regime in order to help them govern as they seek to build this new society that they had promised.
So, is this similar to a rise in centrist ideology? I know the only thing that I have to work with, other than Britton's book, is thinking about during the '90s and 2000s. It was really important to be center or just left of center or just right of center. Like we abhorred extremes, and there's this centrist desire to be seen by other people as reasonable. You know, I'm just curious if that's what you think would be um, what that's getting at.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. I think there's some kind of an impetus to paint the old regime as the crazy ones.
Hmm.
And if they're the crazy ones, then we have to be kind of the same calm ones who don't do anything sort of radical.
Right.
And so there's sort of this natural inclination, maybe towards the center a little bit, at least in terms of tactics and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And I think there really is something to the moderately minded people who have maybe been playing the game for a while already,
Hmm.
and they just kind of slide into those positions almost seamlessly.
Yeah.
And and Britain goes on and says that during this initial rule by the moderates, there are extremists within the revolution, who find themselves sort of dissatisfied with the progress that's being made, or maybe the lack of progress that's being made, and they sort of um, become the new opposition party almost.
Mm.
Um, the moderates are busy trying to govern this new society, and the extremists are free to just critique everything that they're doing and demand change at a pace that's not practical. And then this gives rise to what Brinton calls the period of dual sovereignty, in which the extremists start to establish their own institutions that vie for the power that's being wielded by this new regime. The extremists begin to identify the new regime with the vestiges of the old regime. So, these new guys who are in power, oh, look, they're using those same things that the old regime was doing. And so they try to make connections between the old regime and the new regime. And they end up calling for the removal of the new regime and the installation of another regime that's going to be uninhibited by all of these vestiges and shadows that are left over from the old regime. And that's actually a necessary thing in order to then usher in this brand new society that we've all been hoping for from the beginning.
It's interesting that the institutions is, I thought that that was just a today experience, going back and thinking that similar things happened in other revolutions as to what's similar to today. And I'm not making a statement whether we're in a revolution or not. I'm just saying there seems to be a proliferation of institutions that are in line with the new Tao, right? We talked about the Tao in the previous season. They've established this new norm. The Overton window has gone so far left that there's these institutions that not only support the movement of the Overton window, but operate on the far left side of that are saying things like, "No, Bernie, you won't do enough in office." You know what I mean? Or uh, insert institution here. You got your Black Lives Matter, you got your Planned Parenthood. What do they call those? Safety escorts. I can't remember what they call. But there's, I mean, our society is replete with institutions such as these
Yep.
that don't see their new regime that's clearly in the White House as being far enough. They don't go far enough. So I do
Yeah.
find that interesting parallel.
Yeah. And, our current rulers certainly use the the tools that are left behind from, of course, we're getting ahead of ourselves here, but they're certainly happy to use the tools that are left behind by the old regime in
Yeah.
order to further their own agendas. But then that turns around and gets used against them by the extremists among them to say, well, look, you're doing the same thing that the old regime was doing.
Hmm.
So it is fascinating to see take place in front of our own eyes.
There's a fascinating interview. Tucker's been killing it lately with good interviews, and
Yeah,
you
he
know,
has.
you can you know complain about how he interviews certain major authoritarian leaders, but um, he just interviewed. I cannot remember her name. It's G.
G. Van Fleet.
Yes, yeah, that's her, and she survived the Cultural Revolution that Mao uh, perpetrated on his people. And it's interesting to me because this obviously was talked about in Brinton's book, but once the Red Guard, who was used to take out all the old vestiges of, old teachers of the old way, all traditions, all everything, Mao shut them down. Like, he gave them a short leash, he gave them a long leash, and then yanked them back really hard, right? And I don't know that it's so fascinating how this works, how this all coincides.
Yeah, I think I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the things that she said as we move along through
Yeah.
Gordon's essay here, because I'd like for her to read Gordon's essay actually. because she makes a lot of the same observations that he and Brinton make, but she's
I
making them specifically in relation to China.
I would love to see if we could reach out to her and get her for an interview. I
Hmm.
think that would be fantastic.
Well, I'll ask the two people I know. Cole, do you have any connections? There's one.
I'll see what I can
Max
do.
isn't here, but I'll
Yeah.
call him on the phone and ask him.
Yeah, yeah. I'll see what I can do. I'll see what
Okay.
strings I can pull.
All right. So, stage four. According to Britain, the extremists inevitably prevail because the moderate new regime is sort of bound by conventional tactics, and and they're moderates. The extremists, they're extreme, they can take extreme measures. They don't have to concern themselves with ruling. They're able to link the new regime with the old regime, and any of the lingering problems that are the fault of the old regime, they connect to the new regime. And the solution that they ultimately propose and then implement is the displacement of the new regime with another regime, a third regime that is untainted, untouched by any of the vestiges of the old regime, and that's willing to go to any lengths in order to build this new society that has been promised from the very beginning. It might take some time, but the new regime, according to Brinton and Gordon, eventually gives way to a third regime that is controlled by the extremists.
Mm.
And so this fourth stage is is really the rising up of a third regime of extremists, and lacking the levers of government that were provided by the old regime. This third regime of extremists is forced to consolidate all of its power for the sake of efficiency, and either an autocracy or some kind of an oligarchy emerges and quickly begins delegating power to political appointees or boards or councils that go about the business of actually governing. And the first goal is to eliminate anything and everything that has any sort of imprint of the old regime on it.
It is interesting. I mean, we just did. We've already referenced this once. The Abolition of Man with C.S. Lewis, and how how much reality coincides, and the putting off of the new Tao, or the old Tao, the old order, is something that he saw coming. He knew that this was the route that, um, and I'm sure he was prescient enough to look at other cultures and what they were going through at the time. And I don't know that he ever commented on those per se, but I'm sure that informed a little bit of what he was thinking whenever he was discussing those things. Because uh, I don't remember when what Abolition of Man was. 47. Is that right? 48.
I think that's when it was published. So he gave
Yeah,
the lectures, a year or two
years
before that.
earlier. Yeah,
Yeah.
but at any rate, I mean, certainly Russia's was already well underway
Oh
um,
yeah. Yeah,
at
for
that
sure.
point. So he had that, and then I'm sure he was familiar with the American Revolution and those things. So it's interesting. Just to comment that this is not something that we're making up or anything like that. I mean, there are forces that are looking to get rid of all that is traditional and really all that's good and all that's beautiful and all that's true.
Yeah.
Uh, so,
So before I jump into the next stage here, one of the ways that, or one of the features of a good cigar is you get sort of distinct phases of the cigar. And
mhm.
I'm getting into the middle phase of it here, and it was earthy, maybe just a little bit of cinnamony, if that's a word, in the beginning, and I'm certainly getting less of that now and more notes of pepper, and but still quite enjoyable. So huge shout out to the Big Sky Cigar Company
Yeah,
here in Billings, Montana.
yeah.
Um, well
We
done.
should we should find their Facebook and tag them. I'll remember to do that.
Yes,
Big
yes,
Sky
absolutely. Big Sky
Cigar.
Cigar Company.
Yeah, I'll see what I can do. I love a good cigar, and finding new boutique cigars are always fun.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen these in a few different cigar shops, and I'm always tempted to pick one up, but then I'm like, I don't know. If I don't like it, then I'm out of, But when it's given as a gift, I'm happy to take it. So
And now
shout
you
out
know.
shout out to Ryan. Thank you, Ryan, for the gift. Appreciate it
Oh,
very, very much. All right, moving into the fifth stage of a revolution. Um, the consolidation of power by this third regime of extremists and the desire to eliminate anything that was even touched by or anything that even resembles the old regime ushers in what Brinton calls the reign of terror. And
mm,
I think he takes this obviously from the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror. Um, but it's the stage of the revolution in which this third regime systematically uproots and burns anything and everything that can be linked to the old regime in any way. So think of Stalin's dealings with the Russian farmers. Think of Mao's Cultural Revolution, which you've already mentioned. Think of the French Reign of Terror.
mm.
Um, so from individuals who may have been part of or maybe merely sympathized with the old regime to institutions that sustain the old regime, everything has to go.
Yeah. Well, and you stop short of talking about America's reign of terror in, post or at the end of the revolution. There was very clearly, and unless your history has been whitewashed, you wouldn't, I mean, if it has been whitewashed, you wouldn't know this, but the tarrings and the featherings and the Tories and all that they endured towards towards the
Oh
end of
yeah,
that revolution. I mean, it is ghastly
yeah.
what happened to
It,
that.
and Brinton references that too in his book. Gordon
Hmm.
doesn't talk about it, but Brinton does. And any of the sympathizers with the crown, man, I mean, property confiscated. I mean, they were treated badly. Let's just put it
Yeah,
that way.
even if you're a newspaper determined to remain neutral as could be at the time, right? And you just report it. Like if there was ever a crown leaning story printed, and you're in a majority, uh, revolutionary era, continental era area, you're you're going to feel the pain. It's going to happen. You're going to have, your press stolen or your house burned down or something crazy. So that this is something that happened in America, unfortunately, in the early goings on.
Yeah, and the effect of this reign of terror is that all of the old regime, whether it's statues that the old regime put up or museums of previous wars that the old regime fought,
Mm,
or the institutions, the people, um, all of it is razed.
to the ground.
Meaning it's cut off. It's like
Yeah.
they take a giant bulldozer and just scrape society and just scrape all of the old regime off.
Mm.
Um, so this is this is from Gordon here. The effect is that everything is raised along with anyone who is unwilling to do the raising.
Yeah. You have to participate and agree
Yes,
with.
yes,
Absolutely. Yeah.
yes. So if you're not willing to do the raising with us, you're going to get raised
Yeah.
along with the old regime. And that's the link that they have to go to in order to eliminate everything
And to establish the new order.
and establish the new order.
Yeah.
And once this raising has taken place, it leaves really a blank canvas on which this third regime can paint its new utopian society in whatever image it wants.
Hmm. Yeah, that's terrifying to think. Um, because you could be, if you find yourself in a revolution and it's good taking place, you could literally be determined to not be involved, and that is you proclaiming your allegiance with the old
Yep.
just by not getting involved.
Yep.
And so, really, sideline sitting is not an option if you find yourself in a revolution.
Yep. There is no neutrality. And that's true when it comes to God, and that's true in everything. Um,
Yeah.
the old saying, "You're either with us or you're against us."
Mm-hmm.
That's the way it's often viewed. So,
Hmm.
from that fifth stage of the reign of terror, um, we move then into the final stage, what Gordon calls the new normal.
Yeah.
Um, he says that these extreme measures taken during the reign of terror, this totalitarian reign, these totalitarian means that are used by the third regime, while they're extremely effective, they can only be tolerated for so long,
Yeah.
right? A people can only withstand that kind of abuse for a definite period of time. Um, and I think Britain actually says that after this reign of terror has gone on long enough, eventually everyone is cut by the razor, and you run out of people to to
Yeah.
raise, and pretty soon everybody's been impacted by it, and the people start to kind of think back to a time when things weren't this bad. There was a time when I didn't have to worry about getting shot if I went outside my house.
Right.
I mean, gosh,
Right.
maybe we should, start to go back. And they almost begin to pine for what had gone on before, whether it was the second regime or the old regime or whatever. They're really looking for something different. And once there's a critical mass of people who say, you know what, this is enough. We can't stomach this anymore. It gives rise to then a fourth regime of moderates again, not the same moderates as before, because
Right.
they're gone. They've been raised, but a fourth regime of new moderates who promise all of the good of the third regime without any of the bad that came along with it. And so the old regime is scraped into oblivion, um, and the foundation of this new society is in place, and this new reign of moderates establishes what Gordon refers to as the new normal.
Mm.
And this new normal is the society that then perpetuates after the revolution.
Yeah. So it turns out you can distill revolutions down to these stages. I mean, it really follows whenever you look at them. And I couldn't agree with you more that I think everybody needs to read this book, certainly this essay, and really appreciate what history is telling us. The quote is out there. Everybody probably knows it. Those that don't study history or know history are destined or doomed to repeat it. And I think we find ourselves in a situation now where, we talk as Christians that how we're in the most the scripturally illiterate time probably in the last 200 years. And we have the most access over the last 2,000 years to the scriptures. And I think in the same way, and partly this is because there are textbook companies that are getting rid of some historical fact, and historical inquiry is not as honest as it used to be. But we are in the most historically illiterate time. It's certainly since I've been alive, and I'm sure even going back and talking to a boomer, a baby boomer, in their grasp of history is significantly better than the modern generation, whatever it is, Z, or I don't know what it is. But this is shameful. And as a listener, I would encourage you. I know that history may not be your subject, and you may struggle with dates. I know that's a thing that I hear a lot from people. I just don't know the dates. The dates are really irrelevant. Um, Understand things that have happened in the past. Understand why certain things happened in the past. It's super important to understand those things so that you can apply that knowledge to today. And it's not just um, the large socioeconomical strokes of history. I mean, get excited about your family tree. Know who you are, where you're from. I mean, there. I can go down this rabbit trail forever, but just make sure that you are connected with the fact that you are derivative, that you came from somewhere, and your situation comes from somewhere, and there are certain things that happen in history to come to a point where you exist, and you're part of it, and you can't you can't ignore that. So just as we move forward in time today, over the next year, acquaint yourself with some American history, acquaint yourself with some world history. And I think Brenton's book would be a perfect way to do that. So,
Yeah, absolutely. It's not coincidence that the time frame in our own history when we stopped learning history is not coincidental. And maybe we'll talk about this, I think, in the next episode.
yeah.
Um, but we are not. So this is a shout out to classical education because
Mm.
most of our society has been how do I put this? Um, the history of revolutions has been hidden from most of our society as they've grown up through the public education system. So yeah, we look at the American Revolution, but it's all those terrible Brits and they were mean to us and all that, and we should be a city on a hill and freedom and so we kicked them out and built a great society, and that's about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
And and
And
and we
maybe
don't.
that a guillotine was used in the French Revolution. Maybe
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
Yeah.
maybe. Um, and like G. Van Fleet mentions with Tucker, we don't learn anything about the Chinese Communist Revolution. We don't really learn anything about the Russian Revolution. I mean, maybe
Yeah.
sort of that it happened, um, you know, but that's it really. Um,
Yeah.
and and I think that's by design, and it's left us in a place where we're really detached from the world that we live in, and how we got to where we are today. And so this is how I link this back to classical education. A good classical school in elementary grammar years is going to teach kids, here are the things that have happened in revolutions. Okay,
Mm.
that's pretty good. Dates and events, that kind of thing. And in the logic stage, they would look at something like this portion of Gordon's essay and see how one stage led to the next one. And what is it about the reign of terror that necessitates moderates eventually taking over again? And they would analyze the relationships between those things. And then in the rhetoric stage, they would then talk about how we fit into this and how has this brought us to where we are. And we would look at the conditions around us and formulate our own judgments and views of the conditions around us and determine how we should live today
Mm.
in response to the conditions around us. And
Yeah.
that's clearly not happening in public education.
No, no, that um it's not. There's a clip that from a movie that, and I cannot remember the name of the movie, but a dad who just lost his wife has started homeschooling, or yeah, homeschooling his child, and uh, his sister or sister-in-law, one, is really upset that he's doing this, and they're in her house. I guess she was watching him for some period of time, and she's telling him how much your son needs to be in public education, needs to be going to the public school, and he goes, "Oh, really?" And then he calls her child, so down the stairs, and he calls his son down the stairs, or his daughter, and starts asking questions about the American Revolution. And the public school kid was just he he didn't know. He didn't know any of it, right? And it's so well done because this kid not only has memorized obviously the script for the movie, but just go with me for a second. She memorizes the preamble to the Constitution or the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. She goes through and discusses the different things that were going on the ground there, how we ended up being in the revolution. I mean, it's really funny, starkly contrasted, and I think it's done well because I've had that same experience where I deal with public school educated children and I deal with now majority homeschooled children, and it's night and day difference. And I know we've discussed this before, but I saw that clip since we recorded our season one. I thought, oh, this is great. You know, this is perfect to describe what's going on in society.
Yeah, it's so true, and it's one of the things that allows things like the Reign of Terror to take place.
Mm-hmm.
When we don't see the connections between things, and we don't even notice the things in order to see connections between them so often, and so we
Right.
just kind of float through, and whatever happens, well, it's just kind of happens, and we just kind of float through it.
Mm. Well, Jay, did you finish your cigar? Have you made it to the final third?
Just about, pretty close.
So it hasn't
Not
changed
quite.
profiles yet.
Nope,
Yeah.
nope. But
Okay.
yeah, huge shout out to Big Sky Cigar Company. I'm impressed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's high praise there. So definitely appreciate your experience. I'm living vicariously through you, although I did have a good stogie. And we will be posting this soon, and we look forward to seeing you guys next week. And we'll be talking about the next portion of Neil Gordon's essay, which is a real barn burner,
Yeah, so
so to speak.
the next subsection in this part of his essay is titled "The Current Stage of the Modern American Revolution."
Yeah, yeah. So spoiler alert: we're in a revolution as we speak. The question is, what side are you on? Are you the revolutionary or are you the what are we calling it? Counter-revolutionary. That's what
Yes,
Mr. Gordon calls it. So,
yes.
but until next time, we pray God's blessings on you and look forward to hearing your comments. As listeners, this podcast can't happen without you, and we need your support, whether it's through liking and just commenting on our things. But keep us in mind when people ask you, everybody talks about what podcast are you listening to? That's just a normal thing people talk about nowadays. Keep us in mind. We would love to interact with more and more people and see some of the things that we're talking about actually uh, make an impact. So please help us out with that. But until next time, we will see you next week. God bless.
The kings who fight against my Lord shall taste his wrath and meet his sword.